Good day, everyone. Welcome to the Inverted Orthodoxy podcast. I am Blake. I'm with Kyle and Doug. We're pastors at Living Springs Church, and we're here to take you through the twists and turns of faith. We answer your questions. So if you got questions, we will try and give you some answers.
Well done.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
How are you doing today?
I think if people are listening to this, they're going to assume we haven't talked yet today.
This is true.
Well, we've been in a staff meeting for 2 hours together.
But I'm doing good.
Yeah.
That's good.
How about you, Kyle?
Same. Doing well. How
Right
about
on.
you, Blake?
I am.
Other than cold.
Sure. In this time and space that we find ourselves in, it is freezing.
You know, I said to Blake this morning as we were walking to the church, I said, do you ever stop to consider that possibly the reason everybody has to deal with all of this cold weather is because God's trying to get him to deal with his heart? And like his sin is affecting everybody.
Wow. We have been talking about how sin affects others in the world and all that.
Absolutely.
I've been reminding my daughter every time she complains about the cold that she also hates spiders. So I said, thanks to the cold, all the big spiders can't live here. So you're welcome.
Yeah. I have a hard heart. I could cuddle with a spider.
Or maybe you have a frozen hard heart, and that's it, Blake. That's why you can't change it, because it's hard by the weather.
I'm sure I've told you guys. I don't know if I've said on the podcast. If I have, it's all right. But it's true. I was just walking one day, and it was freezing outside. And I remember thinking, like, Jesus has gone through everything, you know, all temptations and everything, so that he could live like us, and we can relate to him and all those things. And I had a moment where I was like, I don't know that Jesus experienced this. I was like my heart. I don't know if Jesus can relate to me right now. Like, he lived in
I
Israel.
found the loophole. This
Yes.
justifies all my sins because Jesus never suffered this one. This is the one that leads through the
I
rest.
have lots of creation and theology issues around living in the northern parts of this world. I'll just put that out there. But
Love it.
Again, I will say, of the three of us, you're the only one who's lived here your whole life.
yeah.
So you should be the one who's like, it's just how it is.
Or it just wonders why.
Like
why
every-
don't I move?
Every winter, you have experienced the same thing.
Yeah, it gets worse every winter.
Nope.
I liked it as a kid. I remember really liking winter. I can remember this time that I enjoyed winter.
Statistically, it's getting better.
That's probably true. That's true. I don't even think we've hit minus 30. Like, I don't think.
No.
Wow, way to
hit
say that
minus
out
30.
loud. Knock on something wood.
Well, this has been a good winter. But it's the temperature swings, right? Like, we had such nice weather, so we're around 0 degrees, and then it's minus 25.
Yeah, we weren't ready for the
that's
climate
what
change.
your
Would you
body
rather live
rebels.
somewhere where it's just minus 25 for like 6 months?
I think I probably could. Like, I worked in Fort McMurray, although I complained when it was minus 40 for 4 weeks. But I spent a lot of time in Cold Lake when my wife and I were first married. And I remember spending like an extended time. I think we were there 10 days one year. And it was like minus 20 the whole time. And I was like, this is what happens. Your body just adapts and you're just like, okay, it's minus 20. Mm-hmm. But your body does not adapt when you have the temperature swings. I think that
Do
might
you
be part of it.
do you remember this morning in staff meeting, we're reading a book, Ordering Your Private World.
Yeah.
And we talked about how the one quote that really was like so meaningful was like, it's not about the externals, it's about the state of your heart and the state of your soul. Remember that?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Cool.
With all that said, we should jump into.
I'm going to pray more then. All right, let's do some AER because we do have some.
Time for accusations, explanations, and recantations.
All right, Doug, this is you and I because Kyle wasn't here last week.
I'm off the hook.
Unless Kyle submitted this.
Yeah.
Maybe. It says, I'm sorry, but you didn't really hit the nail on the head with the sex before marriage thing. And being males and being married makes a difference. The no harm, no foul argument on the other side, i.e. not investigating causes no harm, can actually be harmful. I have a female friend who did not consider this aspect before getting married, and they're on the verge of divorce. Spending time in sex tells you a lot about a person. It's not just about pleasure.
I will say, okay, we will have to agree to disagree. I stand by what I said, and I firmly believe that what I said last week helped embody, does the best to embody the way of Jesus that I think we're called to go. And I think since we were talking about abstinence and self-control. I don't know that being married or being male has a whole lot to do with it. I feel terrible that you have a friend who is on the verge of divorce. I genuinely do. Like, there is never hearing about somebody whose marriage is in a terrible place that it doesn't break my heart. That just always gets me. And so I have all the empathy in the world for your friend. And I don't want to speak to the specifics of that situation because I don't know the specifics of that situation. And so I feel like to try to respond to that specific situation, only knowing 2 lines about it from what you've disclosed to me would be very, very inappropriate for me to endeavor to do that. So I want to hold back from doing that. But I just I will have to agree to disagree, which is okay.
Though I wasn't here, I will chime in and maybe I'll cross the boundary. You're not at this point, but I was just, as I read the question or the AER, my simple response is I don't think sex is some disconnected part of the rest of the relationship or of the person. That I think there is going to be fruit and evidence, maybe extension of all the other things that are there. And so somebody's not going to become selfish in the bedroom who doesn't have characteristics of selfishness there without some kind of skewing aspect. Like, again, I'm not speculating on these people in particular, but I can imagine many different hypothetical scenarios of like an addiction to pornography where it all becomes about my gratification and my pleasures. Then you turn that into your sex life there, even though the rest of your life, maybe that isn't a prominent part. Then all of a sudden it shifted your expectations there, or somebody who's not caring or attentive to your partner. That's going to show elsewhere, like aggression. That's going to show it throughout your whole life. And so I feel like that's got to be just one more extension and one more fruitful place of all the other things that are being cultivated in a relationship and in each individual coming to that place. Where I think there's just something there that is supposed to be the fulfillment of all the other things in the relationship and of the individuals, that I can't see how that's not a part of the equation. But
yeah, I read this and it's a different paradigm for me. I grew up in just an understanding that the Bible told us. That's what I was taught, and even my parents and all the rest, that sex before marriage or outside of marriage was just not right. And also with the thinking, everything around that, the sexualization, the lust, pornography, all those things is not right either. So that if you came into a marriage pure in the sense that you hadn't seen sex, you hadn't experienced sex, and neither did your partner, then sex would be something that you would experience together, learn together, all that thing. If you were good of character, you're not selfish, all those things, then obviously you'd work together to make sex well, right? Sure. And if you had experienced those sexualized things or sex itself before marriage and bring it into marriage, well, then of course you have something to compare it to or judge against or hold against your partner, all those things. So I guess I just come with a different understanding and thinking, and I guess I would hold to what I think we spoke to last week. I still believe that is the biblical standard. That is what God wants most for us, is not to have sex outside of marriage. And I think it's because he does hold he wants it to be good, and he wants it to be fulfilling, and he wants it to be something that 2 people do together to show love to each other, right? I think you did a great job, Doug, of even challenging me a little bit on, how I even live my life today. It's not like a right or I deserve or I should get or I should pressure, but how can I bless my wife, right? Yeah. And I think if that is the way that 2 people come into marriage, is how can they bless each other in all aspects of the marriage, including the sex, I don't think we would have as many problems. But I'm willing to admit, obviously, this isn't the only story I've heard about people having sexual problems in their marriage. That's a real thing. And I think it's probably because of all the sinfulness that's attached to that and all just even our wickedness that we bring into a marriage, whether we've had sex or not. Like, we're just people, right? So, yeah.
I would say I think that there's always this desire to figure out what's the right way to do things. Because if I do things the right way, then there will be success. And that's not a guarantee, right?
That's true.
And we need to remember that. And again, I don't want to speak specifically to your situation of your friend, whoever submitted this question. But I do think, and I hear Christians who talk about it all the time, like especially when we're oftentimes when we're worried about discerning God's will, the underlying motivation, there is a desire to do what God wants, but there's also this underlying motivation of if I do the right thing, it'll work out the way I want.
Yes.
And I don't think that there's that promise ever offered in Scripture. Well, I'm going to go stronger than that. That promise is never offered in Scripture. Like, in fact, it goes the other way, that when you look at Hebrews and the people who live by faith and who end up being commended by their faith, many of them died still looking for these things, looking ahead and receiving them as though far off, or something like that is how Hebrews 11 says it. But I think we very frequently will assume if I can do things the right way, everything will work out right. And I just want to say, unfortunately, that is not always the way that it goes.
Yeah.
And I think when you say that, Doug, it just makes me think of marriage all the time. I mean, we even talked about that last week, right? Typically it's young people. They don't have life experience. They don't know. They make these vows to each other. They say for better or for worse. And you don't know what worse is. Like, you have no idea what that could be, like in sickness and in health, right? Like, you could have many reasons where sex and marriage can be not what you expected it to be. And it might not have anything to do with sin or selfishness. It could have to do with health. It could have to do with lots of various things, right?
Yeah.
So again, I did all the right things. I'm at the altar. I'm getting married. So it's going to turn out the way I want. There is no guarantee of that at all.
And I'm not even talking just about sex. I'm just talking about life in general.
Totally. And I was
Right?
agreeing with that. I just was bringing it back to the question in that. But yeah.
So it is, I get the desire to want a guarantee of success. And I'm saying I don't have it, but I have to come to terms with the fact that I'm called to do the right thing, even and understand that it may not conclude the way that I'm hoping that it will.
Yeah.
So,
all right. If you got more AER, keep asking.
Yeah.
Next question, though, or our first question today. We jumped this above because
Relevancy
it's relevant.
to our,
it says, where does the concept of 7 deadly sins come from? There are lots of lists of sins in the Bible, but I don't see one that is specifically based on what we'd call the 7 deadly sins.
Awesome question.
Kyle, I think you kind of alluded to or answered that in this week's message. So
I did a little bit.
I'll look to you.
The earliest one I could find was Tertullian,
Yes.
in around like the either late 100s or early 200s. Is the first list. He had a list of 8.
8. Yeah.
Then there were later lists that were also 8, but slightly shifted. I believe it was Pope Gregory in the 6th century, who gives the official list of 7 that we have now. And yes, there are many lists of sins in the Bible, both Old and New Testament, for formation of thinking and parts of particular conversations that Paul is having, or things that have been specific to the groups that are being written to. None of them restricting or conflicting with the others. I think they are all structured for particular reasons. But as many things within theology, as Christian thinking continues and the Holy Spirit guiding the church's thought process and movement, this was something that, as I was writing it in my first week, we were joining with the church history of saying there are 7 sins that are particularly harmful to individuals and to communities. Not to devalue the concern around other sins that aren't listed here, but these ones have very obvious ways in which they are robbing the whole human. I really like that Chrysostom quote of the about gluttony this week, but I think it applies to many of these 7. These are things that are not just destroying our souls, but our bodies and our souls as well.
Yeah.
And then you extend that, I believe, to the wider Christian community. When these are lived out, they're particularly devastating. And so they're just reflections on things we need to be very aware of.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was funny that there was originally 8, and the church felt like we need it to be 7. 7 is God's number, and so we'll take 2 and combine them, which is very funny. But it is what it is. It's in calling them the 7 deadly sins. It's not saying other sins are not deadly, and it's not saying other sins are not the wages of other sin is not death. Yeah. But if you compile the list, there is 8 lists of sins in the New Testament. That I have found, because I did compile the list. And if you compile the list, the 8 lists, and put them into one, there's around 50 or so sins that are mentioned in the New Testament. At least one is the words of Jesus, I want to say from Matthew, a lot in Paul's writings, and then in Romans 21, I want to say, it doesn't have the list of sins, but the list of sinners from which you can derive what their sin is. Right. And some are repeated more times, and it was just a very interesting exercise I went through a while back. But certainly not minimizing other sin and being like, hey, avoid these 7, but all of these ones, not so bad. But just recognizing and I think not the corporate nature of these sins, oftentimes how they directly impact and lead into other sins and feed into other things and affect then the body and even outside of the body, because it's not just sin in the church that brings death, affects our relationships.
Yep. Because I think the Catholics also recognize them in another name they go by as the cardinal sins, leading to their foundational to all other sins and expressions. Like I think all of this, as you just alluded to, sins grow out of them. So because of pride, what are the other things that become extensions of that one? And so,
Yep.
2 thoughts. One, you said Romans 21, so just
Revelation 21.
Revelation 21. Okay, perfect. Just for our listeners, if they're looking for Romans 21, they won't find that. And then, do you guys know what
Well, Romans 21 would be 1 Corinthians 5.
There you go. All right.
Sorry, no, it's Revelation 21, my bad.
Do you guys know what the 2 sins were combined from the 8 list to the...
2 were combined into sloth.
Right. I couldn't remember what one.
Despondency. I want to say it was despondency and slothfulness were put into sloth, I believe.
Okay.
I'm trying to pull something up here, but
That
won't be worth.
I could be completely off base, but I think that's what it is. That slothfulness and despondency were 2 different ones.
And I thought vainglory was pulled out and joined in with pride, is what was jumping up in my mind. But I'm trying to pull something.
But there could be different lists as well.
Yes,
that's true.
So
yeah.
But Tertullian was the first one that I was aware of who.
The earliest church father that said, don't do these things.
Yep.
Because they will cost.
Yep.
Who compiled that list of 8.
Yeah.
Yep. Cool.
All right. We'll move on to the next question. Having recently read the book Letters by a Modern Mystic, is it possible to live life in such a manner that we think of God every minute? If so, what are some practical things that make this possible?
I love this. I love this question. I love this book. I've read this book a few times, and I think if you accept the book on face value, then it is possible to live this way, because the book is from Frank Laubach, who was a guy who endeavored to live this way, and it's the story of him practicing that. So I would say, yes, I believe that it has to be possible for that book to have any validity, and I think that other books by some of the mystics of church, I think specifically of Brothers Lawrence book,
The Practicing the Presence of God.
Thank you.
Yep.
Is another one that is very similar in nature and just speaks about this concept of developing a mindset of mindfulness of God's presence at all times.
Yep.
So, yes, I think it's absolutely possible. Practical things to make this possible? Well, the first one is continually working at it. What I loved about that book more than anything else was the honesty about his struggle. Yeah. How he would have some days, and series of days, where everything's going good. And he's like, man, I am walking with God, and it is a beautiful thing. Like, everywhere I go, I'm seeing God. Every moment I'm with God. Then the next letter is like, I have been doing so terrible, and I just am just failing at this game way more than I'm succeeding. And I so appreciated his honesty and his tenacity.
Yeah.
To go, this is something that I want to dedicate my life to. and I'm going to dedicate my life to this thing, even when it will take the rest of my life to get good at it.
Yeah.
Well, in the book, even he talks about the worth of it. Like in the moments where he is noticing God each moment of each day, like there's value, right?
Yeah.
Like the richness of life, the God he sees in people, the way he's treating people, the way he's thinking about things. And then, yeah, it's just like any of us, he just starts thinking about other things and forgets all that, and then it's gone, right? But there is value to it.
Yeah.
One of the most practical things I've ever done, and I've done it a few times, and this started as a teenager. I think somewhere maybe in youth group or Bible study or something, we were challenged to like pray throughout the day. You know, there's a passage of scripture, pray continuously in 1 Thessalonians. Mm-hmm. So I constantly put my hands in my pocket. I just always have. I think my dad does. I think maybe it's just habit. So I just took a quarter and put it in my pocket. And then every time my hand touches that quarter, it was like, oh, like, got to pray, right? And so I've put various things in my pockets over the years, but it's just one easy way for me to like remember. But even that habit, I have to change it up because a weekend it doesn't mean anything anymore, right? But trying to just have something that calls my attention to God, and I think you could have it as anything, but I think that's the most practical thing I can think of is like, what do you do? What are the habits you do that will call your attention to God throughout your day?
Yeah.
Carried a rosary for a while for the same thing.
Yeah.
Put your hand in your pocket, just start feeling those beads. And yeah, it was good. I think systems of accountability and routine are going to be some of the most basic and practical ones of what are you putting in. So now that our notifications are working, we need to get our prayer reminders going again now that they're resolved. So that would be one, or just find an app or an alarm on your own phone and set that going. And then, modes of accountability. I'm, again, beginning to use one called, what's the app we use with the widget? Streaks. There you go. And you can put in accountability of, okay, did I do these things today? And so that one's beneficial. As you can tell, I'm not using it a ton, I'm just getting back into using it. But systems of accountability will cause you to reevaluate, am I doing that thing in that pursuit of trying to do that? And
Yeah. I think one thing is find some spiritual disciplines that you engage in every day. Like, you're not going to walk with God throughout your day if you don't carve out some time in your day to be with God, however that looks, whatever it is you need to do. And I think about like my relationship with Laura Lee and how like we'll text back and forth and we'll connect oftentimes just about different things that happen. Sometimes, can you pick up some milk on the way home? Mm-hmm. Sometimes just something funny happened, whatever it is. But what sustains those brief encounters is also the intentional time that we have together. Right? And I don't know if we stopped taking that intentional time, that the ongoing conversation of life would happen. So I think find some spiritual disciplines, practice some spiritual disciplines. If you're not sure, like I think oftentimes I was having a conversation with someone recently who was saying, like in the church in the 90s especially, like we totally like lifted up the idea of a quiet time. Like it was the only spiritual discipline you ever could, like it was the be-all, end-all of spiritual disciplines. I'd encourage you to read The Celebration of Discipline by Richard Foster. Read The Spirit of the Disciplines by Dallas Willard. Read The Life You Always Wanted by Joan Ortberg. There's a wide range of spiritual disciplines that you can engage in that will help just be that means of grace, according to Dallas Willard. So I would say make sure you're practicing spiritual disciplines if you want to do that. The other thing for me that's really key is recognize it's not going to be easy. It's going to be a struggle. It's never going to come naturally, I don't think. Maybe God will at some point change our hearts and it'll be easy. Thus far in my life, that has not been the case. But literally my lock screen on my phone right now says, with God, all things are possible, not easy. Because I was reflecting one day on, I think it's the story of the rich young ruler. And after he leaves, Jesus says how hard it is for the rich to enter the kingdom of God. And it's easier for the eye to pass through, or a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. And then the disciples are like, well, then who can be saved? And he says, with God, all things are possible. And I was reflecting on that one day. And I was like, I've never really stopped to ponder the fact that it doesn't say it'll be easy. And the problem with being rich, and I know probably most of us here would not consider ourselves rich, but we live in a very wealthy world, even if we're not wealthy by North American standards. Simply by existing here, we have wealth. And the danger of wealth is it gives us a lot of opportunity to pursue other things than God's presence.
Absolutely.
Even just my cell phone in my pocket can be something that I just randomly can just turn on and just instead of taking a moment to pray, I can just scroll or play a game or do whatever. So very practical thing for me. I have an app on my phone called 1 Sec. 1 second? 1 sec?
1 sec. Yeah.
And it has this feature where you can block apps and websites. And I'll be honest, I don't have a lot of self-control. And so I made this decision. I was like, if I'm going to not go on any of my games on my phone, I have like a couple of games that I like to play a game at night, just relax and unwind. But if I'm not going to play a game on my phone, or there's some websites that I like to go to, and Sportsnet and the Verge and CNET and different things like that. If I'm not going to do any of those things, it's got this block feature. And so I listed all those games. I listed all the websites that I will typically just scroll through during the day. And in the morning, the first thing I do is I go, okay, at what time today can I go on my phone? And typically I will set it for like 9 or 10 o'clock at night. Well, I'll figure out how long it is until 9 or 10 o'clock at night. And then I'll block all of those things until that time.
Right.
So if you go on my phone right now and look at any of my games, they're all blacked out. And if you tap them, it says you can't go on them. And if you go into my browser and you go to Sportsnet, it says access is restricted. And it will be restricted until 9 o'clock tonight. And instead of me having to have discipline all day long, I only need to have discipline for 1 second. And that's so much easier.
Right.
And so I would encourage you, find some life hacks. Get the light phone if you can't even do that. But for me, this one works, and it works well. And I think it cost like $3 or $4. And I was like, that's $3 or $4
I think it was
well spent.
$14.99 for the year when I got it. Yeah.
Oh, is it
1 sec.
annual basis?
Yeah.
Okay, maybe
It's great. Or maybe it's different since I bought it, because I got it a couple years
maybe
ago.
it is an annual thing. I don't remember. All I know is it's well worth whatever money I've spent on it. Because it gives me the access to all the things I need on my phone. Because you and I have talked many times about, like, we were talking about just let's get rid of our phone and let's go back to a dumb phone or a flip phone. And but there's things on my phone that I use and that I need. And so I'm like, how do I manage this? And I found this simple solution that allows me to turn everything off for as long as I decide I want it off for that day. And set yourself up for success by recognizing you're weak and then putting some things in place, accountability and different things like that will remove the temptation in the moment. And beyond all of that, a very practical thing is remember God loves you. And in him is life. I struggled with disciplines for a lot of my life because I didn't really understand them as this means of grace, of connecting with this God who is perfect love, who I'm not doing spiritual disciplines to get him to like me. I'm not doing spiritual disciplines to get him to impress him. I'm not engaged in spiritual disciplines to hopefully get him to come close to me because he's always aloof and distant. But begin in this place that says, well, this is another one of my sayings, that regularly I will journal it as part of just setting my heart right. Father, you are with me and for me because you love me and I am your child. And that is one of my foundational statements of life that I remind myself of multiple times a day because my view of God gets skewed, and I'm working on God transforming that part and the renewing of my mind in that. And part of that is just rethinking and intentionally focusing on how good and gracious and loving and kind God is. And so if we want to be with him, we have to get a clear picture of who he is, because if we don't see him as the one in whose presence is fullness of joy, the one in whom is life and life to the fullest, the one in whom is perfect love that never changes and that reaches out to us and embraces us on our worst day, we're not going to want to be in his presence, and then we're not going to do these things.
Perfect. I think that leads right into our next question. It says, how can I tell others about Christ in a way that does not seem formulaic, phony, or goofy? I think many of us feel we lose respect when we turn the conversation to our love of God and for Christ.
I very much recognize that, and I struggled with guilt for many years for the lack of evangelism I was offering the world, as had been drilled into me in many times in many church environments. It was a number of years ago. There's a podcast I listened to, Voxology, and they were talking about, just to begin the conversation, the new elevator pitch for Christianity that used to be, and probably many of us grew up with. You're a sinner, I'm a sinner, we're all broken. Jesus died for our sins, paid the penalty so we can go to heaven when we die. That was the old pitch. And not that there's not truth in that, and we could wrestle with all the theological complexities of that conversation for a whole episode or more here. But he said what resonates more with people today, and again, there are theological failings in the simplicity of the statement, was I'm broken and our world is broken. And I think Jesus Christ of Nazareth was the greatest human who ever lived. And if more of us spent more time with him or more like him, the world would be a better place, and we'd feel that, the fruit of that, or something along those lines. Like, yep. That is good, because it resonates with where people are at. And so the first way to not let it be formulaic, phony, or goofy, allow it to ooze out of the experience you've had with Jesus, in the brokenness that we feel, and not trying to cover up anything. I think sometimes Christians have put on a happy-go-lucky face and said, yep, Jesus is the great things, and my life's always awesome because of it, versus the struggle for us to find fullness of life and the moments that we are catching heaven breaking open through the way of Jesus in our world. I think it's going to be helpful and wholesome to allow it to be true. And not trying to manipulate situations to make it happen, but where it comes out naturally.
I also want to recognize the fact that you may lose respect turning the conversation to love for God or love for Christ.
Yep.
We need to recognize that that is something that can and does happen.
Yep.
It happened to Paul. In fact, if you read Paul's writing, he talks about that, Christ is the aroma of God, and that to some it's the smell of life, and to some it's the smell of death. There are going to be people who you could offend with that. Mm-hmm. And I say that also recognizing the three of us are pastors, and so we get a lot more opportunity, and there's a lot more expectation for people to talk to us, or for us to talk to people about Jesus, and just be honest about it. The people, even if they want nothing to do with it, they're going to be like, well, that's your shtick. You're a pastor. You have to do that. So I want to recognize we get probably a lot more grace than maybe somebody else does.
Yep.
But maybe we would, I think sometimes we're like, well, what if I lose respect? I think we need to acknowledge that can happen. There may be somebody who is offended. But the one thing I would say is, I think we're called to be witnesses to what God is doing.
Yeah.
Witnesses to what God is doing in our lives, witnesses to what God is doing in our world.
Yeah.
And I think we shift this noun, be a witness, to a verb. I need to witness. Yeah. And there's a huge change that takes place when we do that, because now I have this script I have to follow, versus me just looking out and looking for where I see God active and recognizing and calling that out and acknowledging that. Yeah. And so I think recognize it's got to flow out of, and it's okay for it to flow out of, authenticity of what's going on and what you see. Yeah. And the one thing I would also say is that people can argue with your points of view, people can argue with the statements that you make, but most people will not argue with your story. Mm-hmm. And so just share your story. Yeah. Yeah. Be honest about what God has done in you and what God is doing, how God has, and it doesn't mean it always has to be flowery, and it always has to be good, and it always has to be just like the wonderful, shiny moments. I think part of the problem is sometimes Christians feel this pressure to only ever be the shiny, happy people, and not to be real and talk about the reality of their life.
Yep.
I definitely, as a teenager, felt this responsibility that I was supposed to tell people about Jesus, that it was like there's things Christians should do, and that was like a big one. I was extremely fearful of it. I was fear of the rejection or loss of respect from others towards me if I was to say, hey, what do you think about Jesus, or whatever it is. I was also really fearful of not knowing the answers. Like, I thought if I tell people I'm a Christian and they ask questions, I don't know what to say, right? And so for a long period of time, I just decided that I wasn't going to do it. I just didn't. But then I read a book, and I don't remember what it's called, but it was by Bruce Wilkinson. And in it, he just shared this idea that God is doing things in people's lives, and that the call to be a witness or to evangelize is a call to join what God is doing. So his challenge was to pray that God would give you an opportunity to share. And that changed my thinking. Like, it went from this responsibility to where I was just supposed to like tell any random stranger or whoever I was working with that day or whoever I was at school with, like I have to tell every single person to, no, I just need to be able to enter into a conversation when God makes that conversation real. And I knew that. Like, it was funny how as soon as I read that, I was like, oh, I bet you if I pray for opportunities, I will get them. And then that made me fearful again. But I just was like, okay, I'm going to do this. And I started praying for opportunities, and it radically changed the way I see people and the way I lived my life from that point on. I love sharing about Jesus. And in those periods of life, probably for the next 10 or 15 years before I became a pastor, I would pray that prayer every day. Like, God, just help me to, or have an opportunity to share. And there were some days where I wouldn't, but there was other days where it was so obvious. And then when I shared, I never lost respect from anyone. Like, because they were ready. Like, God had put them in that space where the conversation was just natural, right? So I just think that I would encourage everybody to do that. I don't know, maybe God does expect you to just go out there and blast everybody, but that's not the way I see it. I think God is working in people's lives at different times. There's times when people are not ready to talk about Jesus in any way. And when you start sharing, that conversation is just going to fall on deaf ears. But if you're praying for opportunities to share about Jesus, God will definitely give you opportunities to share about Jesus, and they will be blessed because you're doing it with him. And then I became a pastor, and I was radically disappointed because I thought as I got to be a pastor, I'd get to share my faith more. I hardly ever get to share my faith. I talk to Christians all day long. They already know Jesus, right? So I even purposely started playing hockey on a team with no Christians. Like, I left all my friend group and everything because I was like, I need an outlet. I need a place where, again, I can pray this prayer. And on that team, it took like 3 years. But there was a fellow who played on the team whose wife died. And I didn't know him very well, but the whole team was like, okay, Pastor Blake. And it was the first time they'd ever said that. Like, I told them, I guess, in some way that I was a pastor. They're like, what do we do? And from that moment on, I had an opportunity to do a marriage for a guy. I had all conversations in that room. I had conversations on our team bus we had. Like, it was just different, right? So, I still crave that. I think those are some of the funnest conversations. But I think they will happen better and well when I'm praying for opportunity to share. So
I'm going to throw out a book recommendation. We've recommended it many times before. Bruchko. Just for read that story about him spending time with this missionary, this tribe as a missionary, and how long he struggled with, how do I present Christ in a way that makes sense in this culture? And I think that's something that the church would do well to begin praying as well. How do we bring the story of Jesus to the people in our culture? Because it's not going to be the same way that was done 100 years ago.
Right.
Because the culture has changed. And I just so loved and valued that thought from that book. The whole book is really good, but that was one of the huge takeaways that I had was, man, we need to be praying. How do I bring Christ into the culture that I'm in?
Yeah.
Another one super easy to read, might be easier to find too, because Bruce Co. I think's out of print. Speaking
I have
of
two
Jesus,
copies that I would lend somebody if they wanted to borrow it.
there you go. Speaking of Jesus by Carl Medeiros was excellent. We did that as a book club book a few years ago, and even just shifts the conversation about, instead of telling about Christianity, speaking of Jesus who you know and you experience. But similar to Bruce Co. and one of the passages that has always meant a lot to me in Scripture is Acts 17, when Paul gets to Marsil in Athens,
Yes.
and begins speaking of the statue that they have, of the statue of this unknown God, with their poetry. He uses their language back to them, and communicate to them what it means to understand his God. And so there's this really cool connection where he understands the way of his world and the struggles that his world is going through, and the poetry that they're using culturally, and the language that they regularly jump to, and he's able to articulate his experience and knowledge of Jesus to them through their familiar modes of communication. And that's always struck me. The church becomes so Christianese, and we speak our things, we live in our bubbles, that Tim Keller was one of the greatest examples of this, of like learning to understand your culture. But James K. Smith talks about this, like Christians and pastors should be sociologists in a way, like we should understand our culture to be able to speak to it in its language and in its struggles. And so, yeah, that story has always meant a lot to me. Acts 17, where Paul speaks in their language to them. Yep.
Right on. I think we've probably got time for another question. It says, what is considered lustful sin? Is it a wandering eye considered sin? Looking at others in a way, feeling attraction and lustful thoughts? Things that I look at on social media, even if I'm in a relationship or not? What's considered lustful sin?
Well, they should come to church this Sunday, because we're working through the 7 deadly sins, and this Sunday is lust.
Oh, there you go.
So
There you go. Ready to go.
Timely time to reach this question. So
Awesome. Or stay tuned for Saturday when your message goes live.
yeah, if you're not local, you can watch it online, because I haven't put it together yet. I have barely even scratched the surface of what I'm going to say. This is such an interesting and challenging question. And it's one of those things where it's like, to me, my initial thought when I read this is, it's the state of my heart in what my eye is looking at. Mm-hmm. On a broad level. Now, there's times where it's also what my eye is looking at. For sure, that can just be sin. But when you talk about, like, looking at others, like, there's nothing wrong with looking at someone and being like, that is a beautiful person.
Right.
Like, I don't think that there's anything wrong with that at all. When we start, like, they say, not wandering, but when our eye starts, like, fixating, and we start letting our heart turn to other things, that's where there's a problem that begins to, that's where it turns into sin.
Yeah.
And I don't think that it matters if you're in a relationship or not, because sin is going to be sin. And I think, like, you could be married and you could have lustful thoughts towards your spouse that are sinful. I think that, and you're supposed to find your spouse attractive, and I hope that people do.
Yep.
But that's not the same thing. And I remember years and years and years ago, I was men's ministry director for our district, and we had a conference, and ended up after late at night having a conversation with some guys, and they were like, it's okay to have lustful thoughts towards your wife. And I was like, no, it's not. No. And they were like, yes, it absolutely is. What are you talking about? Then who can I have lustful thoughts for?
Nobody.
Lust is a sin. And they were like, and I'm like, you guys are so confused. You like you can't even separate being attracted to my wife and lusting for my wife. And they're not the same thing. And we ended up having a long conversation where I was like, the problem with lust is it turns that person into a means to my end.
Yeah.
It turns them from someone created bearing the image of God to a tool that I will use to satisfy myself.
Yep.
And I was like, if you do that to your spouse, that is a horrible, horrible sin.
Yep.
I hope you look at your spouse and you're like, man, you're still pretty.
Yeah.
I don't know if women would say that to men. Handsome, we'll say, if it's going the other way. Because if my wife said I was pretty, I don't know
I
how.
have concern.
Yeah, I don't know how I take that. I'd just be like, what do you mean by that? I need some clarification.
Yeah.
But I'm speaking for me. I'm speaking for guys. I hope you still, everybody, I hope you still find your spouse attractive. But that's not the same thing as lust.
Right. Yeah, I would simply put it down to when you want to use somebody for your own ends. And again, these are just things to throw out, and maybe with something that sticks. At some point, somebody said it's the second look that gets you, something along those lines. Again, that's not going to be a perfect one. You can totally lust on the first look too, but you know, that idea of I'm going to try to continue to look, but it's really objectifying somebody for my ends. You can recognize beauty without wanting to rob it. I've talked about this with my kids, and Eugene Peterson in one of his books talked about something similar, like went to a national park and saw a flower. They had to rip it out of the ground, all of a sudden have it and keep it for their own ends. I've talked about that with my kids while we're out on hikes of like, you don't have to own and grab everything that you see,
Right.
To try to have it for your own desires and fill your own hungers, where I think that's really where I would say lust in my own mind and heart, and as I'm trying to articulate it, becomes when I want to use somebody, whether it be for their beauty, for something else, for my own selfish ends. And so, yeah, if that's going to find its way all over the place, social media, whether you're married or not. I think there's a big difference between attraction and lust, but at the same time, there's a lot of language and history within specifically Christian spheres that has brought those two pretty close to one another from most people's experience. I know things I've read and listened to that outside of the Christian world, those are in some ways experienced very differently than they are within the Christian world, but sometimes purity culture thinking has very much mended those two in such a way where especially Christian males' brains, I'll pick on us for a while, are particularly sensitive towards the inability to draw those two and to look at female coworkers or friends without the ability to distinguish between those two feelings.
Yes, I think that we need to recognize it's the problem with how I see that person.
Yep.
Right? It's got nothing to do with them.
Yep.
It's got everything to do with me.
Yep.
And that's where I say it doesn't matter if it's a stranger that you pass in the street or a coworker or your spouse.
Yep.
Like, the problem is with you and what you are allowing your heart to do and what you're turning that person into. Even if you don't say anything to that individual, right? It's got nothing to do with what you do. In your mind and in your heart, you are turning that person into a means to your end.
Yep.
We are doing a study by Andy Stanley called Guardrails right now with the young adults. And he keeps at the beginning of each session describing a guardrail, like a physical, real guardrail, as something that's placed in the safe zone. Like the guardrail's not in the water or over the edge of the cliff. It's actually on the safe driving spot of the road.
Right.
Guardrails also cause damage. Like when you bump against a guardrail, there will be damage, but it's minimal compared to what the damage would be if you were in the water or over the side of the cliff or whatever else, right? And he talks about having these, using it as an analogy that we put guardrails in our life, that yes, we might bump against the guardrail. There might be minimal damage, but it's not all the way, right? So, we weren't even talking about looking at someone or seeing things on the street, because I'm kind of reading into the question here. As you're walking along and you see an attractive person, that might tweak my heart, or it might be like, whoa, she's whatever, and I might have thoughts that are lustful. But that is minimal damage. And then, as you said, to like look the other way or not look twice or bounce your eyes. I think that was in Every Man's Battle, was the bouncy eyes thought. But yeah, that the minimal damage is done, but not the most. I also think of scrolling media. I've had conversations with lots of people about this, right? Like, I'm not looking at pornography because they're naked, right? But if I scroll my social media, I might see something that's close enough, right? Again, that's a position of your heart. That's, these guardrails, right?
Well,
I think people know, like, again, and even in that Andy Stanley, all the things we've been talking about with guardrails, a lot of it is common sense. Like,
Oh, yeah.
I think that when you say, what is pornography? Like anything that's intent is designed to make you lust.
Sure. Okay.
Is pornography. So somebody doesn't have to be naked for it to be
True.
pornography.
Yeah.
And there are like social media is terrible. Just don't go on it.
Yeah.
Like, just don't go on it. And I say that understanding that people are watching this on YouTube, and that every morning I do daily Bible discoveries and post it to Instagram and post it to Facebook, and that's where people are. But
We're pulling a Paul and meeting people where they are.
I don't go on Instagram except to post my video. And then once a week I go on and see, because my wife will send me funny reels, and a couple other people send me funny, and it's like I'm like there's nothing good on it,
Right.
And I don't. I'm going to sound like a crotchety old man, but man, it's just garbage. And I promise you this: just try going without it, and if in a week, see if you miss it.
Yeah. Coming up to Lent, maybe that's a challenge to people.
Absolutely. Like so the whole thing for me with social media changed Lent, I don't know, a number of years ago. Because I was like, I'm just going to not go on social media. It was Instagram. And I was shocked after 3 days. I didn't miss it. I didn't care.
You didn't die?
I did not die either.
But who knew what food you were eating?
Well, I was never one who posted a
I'm
lot
just kidding.
of what food I was eating. I didn't post a lot. But I just would scroll through and like see what people were doing. And I was like, it doesn't matter what somebody in Ontario is doing. Like I was like, this is how I used to live.
Yeah.
Like
This is
a long time ago.
liberating.
Yes, it was wonderful.
Yeah.
So I'll throw that out there as a little bonus. Oh, it's just there's even though I post on it every day, there's nothing good on it. Just go read a book.
I wish it were to the point where none of it was. We didn't have to use these means. I guess I will put it that way. If our podcast was no longer relevant because people were on this pursuit and in so much Christian community that they were learning these things and studying them on the road, and we were irrelevant and our numbers plummeted because people knew this stuff, and we were just. I would love that. So we try to make the most of using these tools, but yes, it is really easy to get a lot. We get a lot more crap than we get good out of it often.
And we spend so much of our life and our time not living. Like the thing I keep saying to my 10-year-old daughter, don't spend your life looking at a screen. You'll notice none of the people you're watching are looking at a screen. Because looking at a screen is incredibly boring. If you watch, like if you took a reel of somebody scrolling Instagram, nobody would watch that reel because it's boring. Like, go live.
Right.
It's easy to watch someone else live.
Yeah.
It's so much more rewarding to go and live yourself.
Yeah. Good side conversation.
Perfect.
Yep.
We're going to get out of here, but thank you for joining us for another episode of Inverted Orthodoxy podcast. I don't know.
You almost had it.
Every
Almost
week,
had it.
Every week, I'm like, I want to send everybody to invertedorthodoxy.com, and then my brain just.
You used to not be able to say inverted orthodoxy, though.
Yeah.
But
See,
now
you
you
improved.
just mess up on the word podcast.
Podcast. Yeah. This is a podcast. Thank you for joining our podcast. Please check out invertedorthodoxy.com, where you can rate us and review us and tell us all kinds of things and ask us more questions, because we love telling you about what we think of faith. We will talk to you next week. See y'all.